The first night I slept alone. The house did not feel empty. It felt loud, as if every wall had found a voice, and every shadow had learned my name. And I remember standing in the doorway of our bedroom in our small Ohio home, my fingers pressed against the cool brass of the handle, thinking that, after 50 years of marriage, I did not know how to cross that threshold by myself. Because for half a century, there had always been the soft rhythm of another person breathing beside me, the steady presence of a man who had shared my youth, my middle age, my disappointments, my triumphs, my children, my grandchildren, and the 1,000 ordinary Tuesdays that make up a life. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 72 years old, and until 3 months ago, I had never once in my adult life spent a single night without my husband, Robert, in the same house. And when the hospital called at 4:17 a.m. on a rain-soaked Thursday in April to tell me that his heart had finally given out after the long battle, we both pretended we were not losing. I felt something inside me go quiet in a way that frightened me more than the news itself. Because grief, I would learn, is not always a storm. Sometimes it is a silence so complete you can hear your own pulse echoing in it. That first evening after the funeral, when the casseroles had stopped arriving and the neighbors had returned to their own kitchens, and my daughter Ellen had hugged me twice at the door before driving back to Chicago, insisting I call if I needed anything, I found myself alone in the living room where Robert and I had spent countless nights watching baseball games and arguing gently about which of us had the better memory of our early years. And the recliner where he used to sit seemed to hold the shape of him, as if he had only stepped out to check the mail and might come back any second with that crooked grin and a handful of envelopes he would sort through at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall ticked with exaggerated clarity, and the refrigerator hummed like a distant engine. And I realized that the house, which once felt too small for our growing family, now felt impossibly large, as though grief had stretched the rooms into something cavernous and unfamiliar. Robert and I met in the summer of 1973 at a county fair in western Pennsylvania, where I was working the lemonade stand to earn extra money before my sophomore year of college, and he was fresh out of the Navy with a sunburned nose and a laugh that carried over the noise of the Ferris wheel. And he asked me if the lemonade was sweet, or if it had the kind of bite that woke a man up. And I told him it depended on whether the man deserved sweetness or a wake-up call. And he laughed so hard, he nearly dropped his change. And that laugh would follow me through the decades like a song I could hum, even when the world grew quiet. We married the following spring in a small Methodist church, with yellow roses lining the aisle and my mother dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief she had carried at her own wedding. And we moved into a one-bedroom apartment with peeling linoleum and a view of the alley. And we thought we were the richest people alive because we had each other and a used sofa someone from church had given us. And in those early years, we learned the language of partnership, how to apologize without losing pride, how to sit in silence without feeling lonely, how to argue about money and still fall asleep holding hands. Robert worked construction by day and took night classes to become a building inspector, and I taught second grade, the local elementary school, coming home with chalk dust on my skirts and stories about children who struggled to read or who had lost their first tooth. And we would sit at the tiny kitchen table eating spaghetti from mismatched plates, planning a future we could not yet afford, but believed in with stubborn faith. When our son Michael was born in 1978, Robert held him like a fragile miracle, his rough carpenter's hands trembling as he whispered promises I could not hear, but trusted completely. And when Ellen arrived 3 years later, fierce and red-faced, Robert cried openly in the hospital room, saying he never knew his heart could stretch so wide without breaking. And I think now that loving someone for 50 years is exactly that, a constant stretching that you pray will never snap. We weathered layoffs and recessions, a mortgage that sometimes felt heavier than the roof it paid for, teenage rebellion, college tuition bills that kept me up at night, and the slow aging of our own parents, whom we buried with the same stunned disbelief that would one day visit our children. We fought, too, over small things that seemed enormous at the time. The right way to load a dishwasher, whether to move closer to the city, how strict to be when Michael missed curfew. But even our angriest nights ended with one of us reaching across the bed in the dark, fingertips brushing skin as a truce, and a reminder that we were on the same side. On our 40th anniversary, Robert surprised me with a trip to the coast of Maine, renting a modest cottage where we walked along rocky beaches and talked about retirement as though it were a foreign country we might one day visit. And he told me, standing against a backdrop of gray Atlantic waves, that if he had to choose his life all over again, he would still pick me at that lemonade stand, even knowing every hardship that followed. And I laughed and told him he was sentimental in his old age. But inside, I tucked those words away like a letter I might need to reread. When his health began to falter 5 years ago, shortness of breath, a stubborn fatigue he tried to blame on getting older, I noticed the way he avoided mirrors, as if not seeing the changes would halt them. And I became the keeper of appointments, the organizer of pill bottles, the quiet sentinel listening for changes in his breathing at night. And though neither of us said it aloud, we both understood that time, which had once seemed abundant, was narrowing into something more precious and fragile. The last conversation we had in the hospital, the one that replays in my mind during the quietest hours, was not dramatic or cinematic but simple and ordinary, because he asked me if I had remembered to water the hydrangeas, and I teased him for worrying about flowers when the nurses were adjusting machines around his bed. And he squeezed my hand with surprising strength and said, "Maggie, you'll be all right." And I wanted to argue with him, to insist that being all right was not the same as being whole. But the words lodged in my throat, and I nodded instead, because after 50 years of marriage, you learn that sometimes love is letting the other person believe what they need to believe. The night after the funeral, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and carried it to the bedroom, half expecting to see Robert propped against the pillows, reading one of his mystery novels, glasses perched low on his nose. But the bed was neatly made, the indentation on his side already fading as though time were smoothing him away. And I sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the unfamiliar quiet, until the house settled with a soft creak that made my heart leap. I lay down on my side of the bed at first, rigid and alert, and stared at the ceiling where the faint glow of the streetlight outside cast a pale rectangle of light. And I realized that I did not know what to do with the space beside me, that vast expanse of sheets that had always held warmth and weight, and the comfort of shared dreams. And after an hour of restless turning, I slid across the mattress to his side, pressing my face into his pillow, which still carried the faint scent of his aftershave. And I wept with a sound so raw it startled me, as though some animal part of me had finally found its voice. Grief is a strange companion. It arrives uninvited, rearranges the furniture of your heart, and insists on staying longer than you think you can bear. And yet in that first night alone, amid the tears and the aching emptiness, I also felt something else, something quieter but persistent, like a thread woven through the fabric of my sorrow. And that was gratitude, because loving someone for 50 years is a privilege not everyone receives. And the pain I felt was proof of a life richly shared. I began, in the weeks that followed, to talk to Robert in the mornings as I poured my coffee, telling him about the weather, about Ellen's latest promotion, about the way the maple tree in the backyard had finally grown tall enough to shade the porch. And sometimes I would catch myself laughing at a memory and then feel guilty for the laughter, as though joy were a betrayal. But I am learning that it is not. That joy is one of the ways love survives loss. My grandchildren call every Sunday evening, their bright voices filling the phone with stories about school plays and soccer games, and they ask me if Grandpa can hear them from heaven. And I tell them I believe he can, because I have to believe that love does not simply vanish, but changes form, like water turning to vapor and rising beyond our sight. The first night alone was the hardest. Yes, but it was also a beginning I did not recognize at the time, a threshold into a life I never asked for but must now learn to inhabit, a life where I carry both absence and memory in the same hands. And as I sit here at my kitchen table, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window, I can still hear Robert's laugh echoing in the corners of this house, not as a ghostly sound, but as a living part of me, woven into my speech, my habits, the way I still set 2 placemats before remembering I need only one. And if there is a lesson in spending your first night alone after 50 years of marriage, it is this: love does not end at the edge of a hospital bed or the closing of a casket. It endures in the quiet rituals of survival, in the courage it takes to turn off the light and lie down in a bed that feels too wide, in the decision to wake up the next morning and make coffee for one and still whisper, "Good morning," to the empty room. I do not know how many more nights I will have in this house, how many more seasons I will watch from this porch, where Robert once sat with a newspaper folded in his lap. But I know that the girl at the lemonade stand and the woman who now sleeps alone are the same person, stitched together by 50 years of shared mornings and whispered apologies and ordinary miracles. And when I finally drifted to sleep on that first solitary night, tears drying on my cheeks, I dreamed not of hospitals or funerals, but of a county fair bathed in summer light, of a young man with a sunburned nose, asking whether the lemonade was sweet. And I woke with a fragile but steady understanding that though my bed may be empty, my life is not, because it is filled to the brim with a love that death could not erase. And that, for a 72-year-old American woman learning to navigate the quiet after 50 years of marriage, is both the ache and the blessing I carry forward into every new dawn.